Today we're going to complete the Chumash, the discussion about the 5 books of Moses, ending up with the book of Deuteronomy. Now, one of the reasons why I'm going to begin, though, we're all going to look at a passage in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. We have different copies of the Bible, so I can't tell you what page number it is, but chapter 19 of Leviticus. The reason that I'm starting with that, aside from the fact that it's pertinent to our discussion, is that according to Christine Hayes, biblical scholars are quite certain that the passage beginning with chapter 19, actually it starts a little bit in chapter 17, but the real heart of it begins with chapter 19, was probably written at the same time as the book of Deuteronomy was written. Now, we know from internal evidence in the Bible that the book of Deuteronomy was discovered during the reign of King Josiah, which would be about 600 before the Common Era. Now, how do we know this? King Josiah is vividly described in the book of Kings as being a fervent believer in Yahweh. One of the things that he did was to remodel the temple, to clean it up, to repair it. Now, how many of you have ever had the opportunity to remodel your house? Well, one of the things, some of you raise your hand, one of the things that happens is that you clean up everything for remodeling, a real house cleaning. And imagine what they discovered when they cleaned the temple up. They found a document that had never been known before. And what was it? The book of Deuteronomy. And they celebrated it. And they made a real festival. Imagine what a priceless document that they had found. I recently, just a few days ago, read in the news that a letter that Albert Einstein wrote to a friend in which he talked about God and Israel sold for auction for $2.9 million. Now imagine if you were cleaning your house and you found the book of Deuteronomy and put it up for auction. I can't even guess what it would be worth. Well, so this passage in Leviticus chapter 19 is called the Holiness Code. And it contains what is generally regarded as the heart of the Bible, the ethical and moral basic text in the Bible, the Holiness Code. So take a look at it. Chapter 19. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, 'You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall each revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I, the Lord, am your God. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God.'" We're going to skip a paragraph to get down back into the heart of it. "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleaning of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly. Do not deal basely with your countrymen. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your kinsman in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. That's the basic view of the role of human beings to each other, ideally. That really is the heart of the moral tradition of the Bible. Now we turn to Deuteronomy. the things that Christine Hayes makes a very interesting point is that Deuteronomy, the very name Deuteronomy, means the second version. Moses is about to die. And before he dies, he gives a farewell. He actually gives 3 farewell addresses to his people. In those addresses, he summarizes their whole history from the time that God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, spending 40 years in the Sinai, giving them the 10 Commandments, and finally on the borders of the land of Israel. Some of the great passages of the Bible and most influential are found in Deuteronomy. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we read the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We know this to this day as probably the most familiar of all of the prayers. Traditionally, a Jew from earliest childhood would say the Shema when they go to sleep at night, every night. The Shema expresses the fundamental faith of the people of Israel in one God, the central tenet of their religion. The book of Deuteronomy contains a number of stories that we talked about last week, important events. Revelation at Mount Sinai, the building of the golden calf, the revolution of Korach. It also contains a very interesting story which has a relationship with the main point that I'm going to make before the end of the class. They're getting ready to go into the land of Israel. So Moses does a very wise thing. It's this kind of thing that every major company does before launching a new product. And here they're coming to a new land. A market study. What's it like in this new land that we're going? So he sends out 12 scouts to explore the land. What are we getting into? And they come back with a report. Actually, a majority report and a minority report. One of the things they all agree to is that it's a beautiful country. Let me tell you, anybody, even today, who goes from the Sinai desert to the land of Israel will be amazed at how beautiful this land is, flowing with milk and honey. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. However, there's a big problem. There are people living there who have built big, strong cities and have big armies, will never be able to make it. We're a bunch of former slaves, never had any experience in warfare. We don't dare even try to go there because of those strong defenses. Two of them, one was named Joshua, which I'm very happy with. The other was Caleb ben Yefune. Came back and they said, after 40 years, we've gone through so much, and we finally arrived at what we all agree is a beautiful land. Let's go for it. They may be strong, but we do have God who's already shown great love for us, performed great miracles. Do it. Take a chance. And both presented their reports. And who do you think the people listened to? The majority. That's natural. People do that. God immediately showed his displeasure. When they realized that, some of them said, well, maybe we'll try it. Let's do it. But their heart really wasn't in it. And they were beaten back right away. And they all died in the Sinai desert, except for Joshua and Caleb. And of course, the descendants of the original slaves of Egypt. So the point was that they would only have an opportunity to really create a homeland in Israel if they showed some daring, not being timid or faint-hearted. Remember what we talked about Nachshon. That's what he did when they came to the Red Sea. He said, although it's impossible, I'm going ahead. And so, lacking that kind of spirit, they really could not enter and conquer the land of Israel. Now, another thing that we read in the book of Deuteronomy, it's really very unusual for the Jewish people. in those days. There's a wonderful story in Deuteronomy about the daughters of Tzalafchad. You remember that story? The daughters of Tzalafchad. Well, here's what the story is. Tzalafchad, he had a parallel, actually, in modern times that, as far as I know, nobody has ever mentioned. He was like Eddie Cantor. Namely, he had 5 daughters, no sons. Now, according to the law, earlier in the Bible, when the law is written out in the book of Exodus, and especially in Leviticus, daughters could not inherit. If the father didn't have any sons, the closest male relatives inherited. For example, his brother. Now, the daughters of Tzalafchad, when their father died, appealed to Moses that they be given the inheritance of their father. After all, they've lived with their father all of his life, devoted children, and they were females, but they're making an appeal. It's even strange that in the Bible, when you read the story of the daughters of Tzalafchad, Moses didn't even know what to tell them. He didn't have an answer. What did he do? The Bible tells us that he said, I'll have to discuss it with my boss. And God told him in response, they deserved the inheritance, give them the inheritance. The first time that we really read about equal rights for women in that situation. Generally, Christine Hayes makes a point in which she bolsters with a number of examples that the book of Deuteronomy, while it contained a retelling of the Jewish experience up till that point by Moses, nevertheless, it's not exactly the same. Already in Deuteronomy, we see clear evidence of rethinking, re-evaluating a number of the laws in the earlier part of the Bible. All of them, all of these changes, showing more humanity, more kindness, more understanding of human needs. Let me give you one example, because this example played an important role in American history before the Civil War. One of the problems that they had there, just as we had in America, was the issue of runaway slaves. Very often, of course, slaves were very poorly treated. Most of the time, slaves lived a miserable life. And we know what we did in America with African slaves. Many of them ran away to find freedom. We even had some wonderful accounts in American history about the Underground Railroad. Slaves ran away from the South to find freedom in the North. It's not as though, if you think the Underground Railroad meant that they bought a Pullman seat on a train going north, that was not the case. Good-hearted people in the North sheltered them and enabled them to find their freedom. And if they were caught, they would suffer terribly. And anybody who sheltered them while they were escaping was severely punished. It was a big story in American history. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's a specific statement that if a runaway slave comes to your home, you are to shelter him, provide him with sustenance, and enable him to find a free life. Also, a very interesting change in Deuteronomy that she points out that we would normally not pay much attention to. When I say we, I mean me. There is earlier in the Bible the law. What if a slave says, I love it here. I love you, the master. I love the family. I'm being treated very nice. I'd like to remain this way forever. Believe me, that happens. Sure it happens. You know, I talk to people who've been in Portland a long time. That's been my good or bad luck. I can't tell you how many of them take great pride in the fact that they've had wonderful employees for 30 years, for 40 years, who are so loyal to them. One man even told me, and he's already well advanced in years, he said, you know, I can't retire. I can't sell out my business because I can't leave my employees unprotected. Told me that more than once. So, in the Leviticus, earlier in the Bible, they point out what's the routine for a slave voluntarily remaining a slave all of his life because he enjoys his life. What's the routine? Very strange thing that you do. Anybody remember? It's very strange. What? Julie, what? Yes, what happens? What happens?
Something got an ear to the door.
You're right. You're half right.
Half right.
When you say something, that's half right. I want to know what.
As far as they go.
Pierce the ear.
What?
Pierce the ear.
The ear has to, he doesn't pierce his ear, but the master pierces his ear to leave a permanent mark that almost of shame. This is a man who chose slavery over freedom. Now, where does he do this? Earlier in the Bible it says he does this at the temple, at the tabernacle. In Deuteronomy it says the master does it at the door of his own house. Now, what's the big difference? What do you think?
Goes back to Exodus.
What?
It goes back to the angel of death.
But what's the difference whether you do it at your own home or do it at the tabernacle?
One's public.
What?
One is public.
One's public.
All right, one is public and one is private, that's true.
And one is before God.
But what's more important than that is what Christine points out. It's a lot easier to do it in your own home rather than going to the tabernacle or the temple in Jerusalem. It's more humane. Even privately, it's more humane. Because if it is a mark of shame, you don't have to make a big to-do about it. At any rate, the book of Deuteronomy is replete with many such statements and laws showing a greater consideration for personal, emotional, psychological well-being of the individual. In other words, this is a direct quote from Christine's book. Deuteronomy focuses more on the rights of the slave rather than the master. Now, we come, I think, to the key issue that I want to talk about. Why is it that Moses was denied by God to come into the land of Israel after leading the Jewish people for so long, leading them through all kinds of problems and difficult situations that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. And finally, leading them with a great sense of morality, kindness, and goodness, beloved by all. What a strange ending to the life of Moses. Number one, the whole point, apparently, of his work was to lead the children of Israel from Egypt to the land of Israel. Why wasn't he given an opportunity to rejoice with them and enter into the land of Israel? Well, the Bible gives a very lame duck, a lame explanation for it. Because in one instance, he didn't follow exactly what God told him to do. Namely, there were 2 times when early on, when they came into the Sinai, there was a whole story about the desperation for water, which is not surprising in Sinai. And God had him speak to a rock, and water came out of the rock. A great miracle. But there was a second time when again they were still in the Sinai and still had the same problem of water. And God told him to speak to the water, up to the rock, and they'll get water again like before. And what did Moses do instead? He hit the rock. I've been singing that song for years, and Moses hit the rock. My version was an improvement. From the rock there came forth vodka. But in the Bible it says water. But the Bible says God told Moses, "You didn't do what I told you to do." Instead of speaking to the rock, you hit the rock. Well, big deal, big deal. So what? Isn't it the same magnitude of miracle? It hardly seems an appropriate thing for God to have done. Well, Christine offers a very interesting explanation that I hadn't thought of before, that I thought was really worth all of us thinking about even today. What she said is basically this. Do you know why Moses died before entering into the land of Israel? Not that he was being punished for some trivial act of hitting a rock instead of talking to a rock. He died because his mission had been completed. In other words, his mission was not to bring the children of Israel to the land of Israel. What was his mission? To create a God-fearing and God-loving people. And that he had done. Now, why is that so important today? The reason it's so important today is we have a widespread notion, and I'm leaving it completely up to you to determine how widespread that notion is. The notion that having a state of Israel is absolutely indispensable to Jewish life. Moses died before entering the land of Israel. But what he had accomplished by the time of his death was creating a sense of peoplehood based on Torah and ethics and religious values that would far outlive a political value like statehood. He had done his job. The job of going into Israel was being left over to Joshua, that we're going to be discussing next week. His job was a spiritual job, not a physical job. It wasn't tied up with land, because in the Bible there's an extraordinary statement that says, in the end of Deuteronomy, Moses died, buried by God, and no one to this day knows where he is buried. Never even left a tombstone. My son, Shaul, pointed out to me, thanks, Shaul, pointed out to me that there are only 2 buildings in Israel that are constructed and have survived with Herodian stone. Those buildings are found today at the site of the temple in Jerusalem, particularly the Western Wall, built with Herodian stone, which is a particular style of stone construction. And the other is the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. In other words, for the graves of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have a tomb which is visited today constantly. No one can ever visit the tomb of Moses. Totally unknown. Because, this is the theory, because the life and the life goal of Moses was not land, but spirit. The Torah. So you don't need any piece of land to bear his memory. The Torah is his memory. And we refer to the Torah as Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses. So the book of Deuteronomy, as I've tried to point out, is really a crowning book in the whole section of the Torah. After that, we read the section of the Torah called Neveh, the prophets, starting with Joshua. Then we talk about the land of Israel, the politics, the geography, etc. So we ended really the spiritual fulfillment of the Jewish people. Now we get down to earth, literally, next week. Okay, comments or questions?
Thank you, Rabbi. That was really interesting.
What?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. Two things. Number one, there's a wonderful book. It's written for teen girls, but I think it's well written for any adult. And it's called Blue Thread by Ruth Tenzer Feldman. And it has the story, one of the central themes of it is the story of the daughters of Zelophehad.
Zelophehad, right.
Yeah. And it's about women's rights and women getting the right to vote here in this country in
Right.
the early 1900s. So I highly recommend it. The second thing is I saw that article yesterday about the $2 million piece of writing from Einstein.
$2.9 million.
Oh, excuse me.
I know that 900,000
Is
doesn't mean
nothing.
much to you.
Yeah.
But anyway,
So he talks about the Bible just being stories, and he really kind of badmouths the concept of God. I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
have you got $2,900,000? No, the only thing that I want to comment on is that Einstein was a profoundly religious person, which absolutely does not mean that he went to shul regularly. But he has on more than one occasion said that anyone who thinks he understands the universe without thinking of God doesn't really understand the universe. Now, we had the notion that Einstein was probably as knowledgeable about the universe as anyone we have produced. But he did have a great appreciation of the Bible. And one of the reasons why I wanted to teach this course, based on Christine Hayes' book, is that when we think about the Bible, we think about so much in the Bible that is basically meaningless to us, totally meaningless. We go on and reading about the sacrifices and the lives of people who, like Methuselah lived 900 years and so on. That's not the core of the Bible. And what we are going to be doing the whole rest of the year as well as discovering the core, and that's really what Einstein was talking about.
But he said that God was just made up by man and it was a crutch.
That's not what I read in Einstein.
Well, that's what I read in the article.
Well, you read the article. That's fine. I don't even know about the article.
Oh, okay.
But he never, to my knowledge, never displayed that attitude to the notion of God.
what I'd like to say on that is that Einstein, closer?
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay. Einstein also said God does not play dice, and what he was referring to is the principle, a quantum theory about the principle of uncertainty. So why would a man who recognizes the word belief as belief invoke God does not play dice unless he has some curiosity about God?
I'll tell you, the whole matter of God hinges on how you understand what God is. If you understand that God is like a superhuman being, namely, and we use these words, all wise and all powerful, like Superman, you have, in my view, a totally wrong view of God. God has nothing to do with power, nothing to do with wisdom. Essentially, God is a moral good which does not possess the power of creation or the power of judgment, but does possess the power of inspiration for performing good deeds. That's a huge difference. Are you stunned or just quiet? Okay, well, we'll see you all next week.
Rabbi,
Oh,
you,
oh,
you
okay.
said earlier that,
Yes,
that returning to Israel was the necessity for the Jewish people to continue to exist.
for the Jew.
Right, but what happened in the Middle Ages, in the 15 and 1600s, when there was no Israel? The Jewish people still survived without an Israel.
What happens, what?
How did the Jewish people survive through the ages without an Israel?
I'll tell you exactly. Exactly the same way they survived for 2,000 years without an Israel. Living Jewishly. Thinking Jewishly, acting Jewishly. And that's why I wanted to start with the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code said, "You are a holy people, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Being holy does absolutely not depend on living in Israel. Some of the holiest Jews in the world, and I can give you thousands of names, lived outside of Israel and can continue to live outside of Israel. In large measure, holiness is, as the Holiness Code itself puts it, love your neighbor as yourself. Believe me, you don't have to live in Israel to love your neighbor as yourself. You can do a lot of good loving right here. And I encourage you to do that.
Hi, Rabbi. So some people may infer that if Israel is, not important to our survival as Jewish people, Israel is not necessary today. What is your thoughts about that?
Could you repeat it, please, Doris?
Well, what I'm saying is, from what your remarks are, it seems like Israel is not necessary for Jewish existence. But if so, how can we support Israel and its existence today?
How do
Something
I
like
what?
that. I'm going to come closer.
How do I what? Thanks, Doris. How do I what?
So my question is, if you're saying that Israel is not necessary for us as Jewish people to survive, how do we work today with Israel's existence? I mean, is Israel not important to our Jewish people to continue to exist?
Wow.
So I know, but
Now, let me
it's
explain
important
something.
to me to hear you say
Let
that.
me explain something to you.
Yes.
There is a huge difference between important and vital. Of course, Israel is extremely important to the Jewish people. You know, survival can be minimal. That's what survival means. We cannot flourish as a Jewish people unless there's an Israel. It's important to know that difference. We like to flourish. I would rather flourish than survive. I live in a nice house. You live in a nice house. Believe me, every one of you could survive in not such a nice house, but you wouldn't flourish.
Exactly.
Israel enables us to really flourish as Jews.
You know, I remember, I wasn't alive, but Milt, my father-in-law, told me when Israel became a state, and he was here at Neveh Shalom, and he says, Doris, when they declared Israel as a state and we gathered here, he says, somehow people felt a little taller, a
Absolutely.
little prouder, a little more like they have a home. And I think,
That's the word, flourish.
yes, and I think it's important for the Jews today to see that it is necessary for our existence if we want to flourish.
What I'm saying, you're right, but it doesn't mean that Judaism is going to die out.
Yes, but
That's the point.
yeah, it will not. Clearly, you're right because it survived for 2,000 years or more without Israel.
Right.
But we know what Israel does to the Jewish existence today in our modern world, and so
You have no idea how delighted I am when anybody tells me, clearly you're right. Thank you, Doris. Okay.